Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Bob and Ann for inviting me. Thank you to the council for allowing me to have lunch with them. Thank you to all of you who have braved the hill and made it here today. And for all of you who are looking on Zoom, thank you for coming. The title for this presentation, Gardens of the Enslaved, may appear a bit curious, which is my hope. If you have not put much thought into the connection between enslaved people and gardens, then the title has served its purpose. I have been looking at two specific regions. Virginia, with a focus on the Piedmont region. See if this thing is going. Oh, it says battery. What am I doing? Did I not hit the right thing? There we go. Thank you. Different computer. The Piedmont region of Virginia, which is this section here between the coastal plain and the mountains. And I know the coastal plain gets a lot of attention, being that Fairfax County, the home of George Washington, is there, as is Hanover, where Madison lived. But Jefferson was in Albemarle County, which is in the Piedmont, just as was James Monroe. Also, part of my family was in Albemarle County, but a little further south in Amelia. So Virginia is one, and the other place is the South Carolina Low Country, which is really the heart of this talk. Both regions have great importance to U.S. history, politically and economically. Both are also central to the history of slavery in the United States, with Virginia being the landing place of the first enslaved Africans in British North America, and South Carolina being the landing place of more than 40% of the enslaved Africans who entered the U.S. But there's also, for me, a personal connection between the two. A little more than 20 years ago, I began to do research on my family, really focusing on pulling out information. With a maternal line in Virginia and a paternal line in South Carolina, it has been an interesting and surprising journey. It has carried me back over the history of this country. Having identified people in both family lines that first drew breath in America in the 1790s, I think it's safe to say that my roots extend to the very beginning of this American experiment. On the Virginia leg of this journey, I connected with my maternal great-uncle James Anderson, who was a chef of some renown. As a historian who was interested in food, I was drawn to learn more about him, so I began to research him and the history of food in Virginia. Simultaneously, I began doing research on my South Carolina family, and this had been initiated when I first met my cousin Mamie, who at the time was 95 and the elder of the family, and she told me about the family over bowls of okra soup in her kitchen. She always seemed to have okra soup on the stove. And while it was more than a decade after that okra soup that I started my research, the linking of food and family brought both branches of the research together. And even with regional variations that give the foods of the Virginia Piedmont and the South Carolina Low Country their distinctiveness, there were some similarities that tie the two together. Before I go on, I want to just say something about the kind of materials that have informed my looking at the gardens of the enslaved. The presentation, as most of my presentations are, informed by the field of Black studies, particularly the emphasis on agency and initiative, which expands the way we think about enslaved people. The work of Judith Carney on migration of African foods to North America is the foundation of this presentation. She's done some amazing work, both looking at the foods grown in West Africa, looking at how they were utilized in the Middle Passage, how they made their way to North America, and how they then were brought into cultivation. Jessica Harris is another influence on me in her work. She most recently had a documentary based on her book, High on the Hog, and she's been a friend and a very influential person in thinking about food, thinking about history. In histories of these two regions, there's a lot of work from naturalists and botanists who visited southern plantations in the colonial era. And to gain a sense of the African perspective, which is absent from the recorded documents, I needed to find a way to hear those voices. The writings of archaeologists such as Leland Ferguson and James Dietz aided me with this. Their research on slave communities both supplements and extends the written record. And as James Dietz said, don't read what we have written, look at what we have done. Additionally, the writings of landscape and architectural historians such as Dell Upton and Barbara Heath presented landscapes as a particular socially constructed way of looking at the world and provided different ways of understanding the meanings within the landscape of enslaved communities. Finally, I have used experimental archaeology, planting, growing, harvesting with the African American Seed Exchange, and I'll say more about that later in this talk. One of the things that I know and why I talk about gardens is that by the 18th century, gardens of various types were an important feature of the American landscape, north and south. When you read about the delegates at the Constitutional Convention taking a break from their meetings to visit the gardens of John Bertram and others, you understand how they utilize these spaces, these open space for relief, for rest, for recentering. However, the garden in the South, gardens were an essential part of plantation architecture. These gardens surrounded the main domicile, providing an air of gentility and a contrast to the primary purpose of those plantations, raising crops of slave labor for profit. Many of the men collectively referred to as the founders had a strong interest in gardens. Gardens and wilderness were often metaphors that were for political beliefs, ideas about America, and about where we were going. Initially, the gardens were ornamental, providing solitary spaces and vistas of the countryside, or they were educational, allowing for the study and growth of plants from all over the world. Now, Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, is one of the most well-known and well-documented of landscapes in the country. For Jefferson, a garden was not only the spaces where crops and vegetables were grown. For him, the whole mountain was a garden, and he planned it with this perspective. Though he continued to add to the house and grounds throughout his life, there were already, most of this was done in the late 18th century, and at that time there were already older gardens that existed, such as that of Middleton Place, started in 1741 and being considered the oldest landscaped garden in America. Now, if you've looked at these two images, you can see quite a difference between the two of the gardens. This one has much more geometric shapes, angles, straight lines, whereas in Monticello there's more of the curving lines. And one of the things I know Jefferson talked about how liberty was more reflected in the curving natural lines of nature as he moved away from this type of view. Now, while viewing these gardens, while it's wonderful to appreciate the ideas and that designed them and the ideals they represented, we should also consider what building these spaces involved. At Monticello, for instance, before the house was built, the mountain had to be made level. This and the building of the roads up to the mountain involved shifting tons of soil. Enslaved people used shovels to dig in the hard red clay of Virginia to level the ground and then to dig foundations for the house. Annette Gordon Reed writes of Jefferson observing a team of 4 men, a boy and 2 16-year-old girls, doing this work in the middle of winter, warming their hands over the fire to ward off the cold. Creating the landscape also involved planting large numbers of trees, shrubs, and flowers. And we know that work was done by those who were enslaved there. At Middleton Place, the work involved digging to create reflective pools, transforming cypress swamps into rice gardens, rice fields and gardens. It involved using that soil to create terraced landscapes, and in so doing made some of the land elevations there among the highest in the low country. They're beautiful, but the work that went into them was backbreaking. One of the things that we know, and some of these places now are beginning to recognize the work that Africans did in creating these landscapes, in building them, and making something out of the wilderness. At Middleton Place, the enslaved did the actual work of creating the garden enjoyed by the founders, but these were not their gardens. These are not the gardens of the enslaved. There were other gardens that existed on the southern landscape that served other purposes. I'm looking at the 17th and 18th centuries with a particular focus on the years between 1680 and 1780. It was during these years that British colonies in Virginia and South Carolina moved from single-minded interests in agriculture for production of a marketable export crop to an interest in agriculture for subsistence. It is during those years that they began to be attentive to the foods that Africans and African Americans were growing in their gardens. I am purposely saying their gardens because the spaces were considered part of their domicile, their dwellings, and it was seen as space that they controlled. One factor in the privacy of, or the ownership and privacy of those quarters was geographical. Right? On large plantations such as those in the South Carolina low country, the dwellings for the enslaved were constructed at a distance from the main house, often 200 feet or more. On smaller holdings, like many in the Virginia Piedmont, barriers were often built in the forms of terraces, piazzas, loggias, fences, or rows of trees to make a separation between the slave community and the planter society. The location of the slave dwellings was clearly the decision of the planter. However, the way that the space around these dwellings was utilized was not. When the enslaved had a choice of where to site their dwellings, they had an African-style circular grouping rather than a linear style of straight lines. The story of the gardens planted and tended by the enslaved during the 17th and 18th centuries is an interesting one. The gardens should be looked upon as negotiated space. In many instances, it was not the goodwill of or the frugality of the slave owner that created the gardens. I say that because often it's said, well, they knew that if they grew their own food, they wouldn't have to pay for food for them, so they gave them land. That has some truth to it. The goodwill, no. Rather, the existence was a result of practices or demands made by the enslaved to have such spaces. The creation of gardens was part of a transformative process that altered the landscape of the plantations. The space where slave dwellings and residences were located was provided by the enslaver, and to him it remained a space, an area with physical dimensions with little intrinsic meaning. But for those who lived in the slave community, it was a place. a dynamic physical area that is suffused with significance to those who inhabit it. So creating place out of space is a very important thing that happened at this time period. This is something that the historical archaeologists talk about, space and how it's used and how we see it, landscapes as a way of viewing the world. And one of the things that they talk a great deal about that I am not going into is the way that the landscape for the enslaved was quite different than that for the owner. And there's a great deal of work done where just looking at the way that enslaved people gave directions to a place, how they varied from the way that, say, a plantation owner would give directions, the use of roads or the use of places. Within each plantation, there was a black landscape that took place, that connected all those places, and also connected and viewed them as part of a larger neighborhood that crossed boundary lines of plantations as well. Now, I'm just putting these up because I like to use images. These are two recreations of slave cabins. The one on the left is from Williamsburg, and the one on the right from Blacksburg in Virginia. And I just put them up just as a image to have in the back of your mind. Both of these recreations have garden spaces around them. Now, the gardens and plots and vegetable gardens of the enslaved were part of making this a place, home, meaningful. The space the gardens occupied were filled with significance. Since the enslaved men and women were able to sell and barter what they produced in the gardens, a degree of economic autonomy was provided by them. And because they had the ability to decide what they grew in the gardens, it allowed them to add nutrition to their diets. It also has been argued that the claiming of space and the independent production of food represented a larger idea or belief. That an enslaved person had the right to some of the time he or she labored and to the products that came from this work. That is a very important point. And often, even though we look at those who were enslaved as being completely subordinate, they did have agency, they did make choices, they did make decisions. And the significance of gardens and yards is best understood as part of a cultural context. The yards, gardens, and workspaces were extensions of the dwellings, and much of the enslaved life was lived in the spaces outside of the cabins. Often, the space around the cabins were used for preparing, cooking food, doing laundry, socializing, and it was part of a communal sensibility about how one lived life, about how one interacted with others. Outside was important. While the slave owners' mansions were pulling in, right? Everything was pulling in. The paths were pulling towards, etc. For the enslaved, life was outside. Life was communal. And that still is very much happens in West Africa today, the communal life. Inside is where you go to sleep, get away from people. Outside is where you socialize. Now, another feature of those yards, which was very African, was that they were clean, swept, and hard packed, right? The dirt around the yards is clean, swept, and hard packed. And in fact, some slave owners had problems with that. They thought that they were, not the way the land should be looking. It should have grass, it should have this. But they didn't know that this was a practice that, one, kept insects, snakes, and other things away from the houses, but also was a practice that had been brought from Africa, that clean sweeping. The archaeologists have even shown that that fact. Many of them don't look at yard spaces too much because money, time. But the ones that they have done in comparing the domicile of white colonists and enslaved, they found that for the white homes, you had remains of trash and other things that were in a fan shape outside of windows and doors. That did not exist for the enslaved homes. They were completely clear of that because they swept those every day. And even today in West Africa in the mornings, the young women in the family will sweep around the yard and the house, clean up everything for the day to get it started. Now, another factor was what was grown in those gardens. And I'm going to talk about a few of the crops that were grown and why they are significant. Because often when we're thinking about food and food between old world and new world communities, we think of the Columbian Exchange. We think of the food as it made its way from the Americas to Europe in particular. They also made their way to Africa. But what we don't think about is how did African foods make their way into America, into North America in particular. When one examines foods grown in the early gardens, you get a fuller understanding of agency and initiative of the enslaved in growing their own food and making choices about that food. Some of the foods mentioned as being grown in the garden of the enslaved during these early years in Virginia were okra, peanuts, various types of greens, hyacinth beans, guinea squash, malagueta peppers, and sesame. In the Low Country, they were growing even more African crops. In addition to greens, hyacinth beans, guinea squash, malagueta peppers, and sesame, they were growing yams, millet, sorghum, okra, and rice. In the 18th century, when Europeans began to focus attention on the gardens of the enslaved African and African Americans, many of the foods they saw were unfamiliar to them. This is because they had their origin in Africa. While the seeds for these foods came to North America as part of the provision of slave ships, it was the African people who, using their knowledge of agriculture, planted and cultivated these foods first. Now, what, to expand on that idea, one of the things which has been shown is that one of the challenges for the Middle Passage was having enough food for the enslaved, for the crew to eat. Now, that food could not be carried from Europe. That food was purchased, acquired on the west coast of Africa along with the enslaved people. Add to that the idea that it was felt that feeding the enslaved captives foods that were more familiar to them would have a greater impact on their survival than to feed them unfamiliar foods. And so these foods were purchased in large amounts in various parts of the West African coast, depending on where they were acquiring their human cargo. Now, once these ships reached the Americas, the Caribbean, and North America, often supplies were depleted, but not always. The detritus from those ships was dumped, right? Cleaned out, ready for the next voyage, the next leg of a voyage. Where they were dumped, by the docks, they were acquired by people who were of African descent. The seed stock, and I'll come back to that, was what was acquired. Now, one of the things we know was that one of the earliest crops that is talked about, particularly for South Carolina, is rice. Rice is one of the big crops. An early mention of rice in Virginia goes back to 1648. A letter to England from a Virginia colonist said that they were considering rice as a crop because, quote, "we perceive the ground and climate is very proper for it, as our Negroes affirm, which in their country is most of their food." Right? This is a very interesting passage because while it reflects a European familiarity with rice cultivation, it also defers to the knowledge of the African people, right? It asks them, is this good for rice? Yes, it is. And it also recognizes that Africans had knowledge about growing rice and that it was an important part of their diet, right? It was most of their food. Now, the rice that was talked about, there was no further discussion of that at that time. But in South Carolina, rice was being grown shortly after the arrival of Africans in the 1660s. That first group came in from Barbados. But by 1674, it was reported that some, by English indentured servants who had run away to St. Augustine in Florida, they told the Spanish there about rice that had been grown in South Carolina and shipped to Barbados. This is a key point, the connection between Barbados, South Carolina, and the rice. In 1690, a South Carolina plantation manager claimed to have successfully planted rice in 22 different locations. And when talking about the rice, Mark Catesby said that that first group of rice had not been successful because they used what he called inferior seed. He said, it being a small, unprofitable kind, little progress was made in its increase. Now, what he was probably talking about is this rice here, the red rice, Oryza glaberrima, which is the African rice. A smaller grain and a lower yield are both characteristics of this rice. And added to this was the fact that people who were brought into South Carolina during these years, people who were Malinke, Soninke, Serer, Jola, Belante, Kisi, Papel, Baga, Mende, and Temi were from the region of West Africa stretching from the Senegambia down to Sierra Leone, known as the Rice Coast often. It was a place, it was one of the regions where this species of rice was grown in large numbers. Along the Niger River Delta, there was another big area of Oryza glaberrima. And this is the first rice that was brought or was grown in South Carolina. It would later be supplanted by Oryza sativa, the Asian variety, which has longer seeds and is white when the brand is taken off. But that is not say that the African rice was not important. The Asian version of rice had also been introduced to West Africa. And those folks who came from the rice growing regions, they said, were familiar with growing various types of rice, white, red, rice with beards and without. So the knowledge system that they brought was also extremely important, and they were the ones who began the rice, and then it later takes off. I'll come back to rice a little later. Another of the crops that was found were black-eyed peas. These were used during the Middle Passage to feed enslaved people. They were high in protein, easy to store. Black people ate them. As I said, they were rich in protein, but they also ate the leaves, which are rich in minerals. Black-eyed peas were often intercropped with cereals such as sorghum, and then the stems and vines were left in the field for cattle to eat, which is why they also got the name of cowpeas. Visitors to South Carolina in the 1680s referred to black-eyed peas as crops that seemed proper to the place and to us unknown, right? Proper to the place, right? Now, what we have to understand, and I'll come back to that proper to the place. Another early transplant, something that is dear to me, maybe to some of you, I'm not sure, is okra, right? Okra was another early transplant, and it was in these gardens at least by 1700. And this is Shopi okra, which is found in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and it's different because it has that reddish coloring rather than the green. Even though it was grown early, it remained unfamiliar to Europeans. Even down to the area of the late 18th century, it was unfamiliar. And an Italian botanist visiting said that okra was brought by the Negroes from the coasts of Africa, and it is called okra by them. Now, okra would become very instrumental in a lot of the foods in South Carolina and throughout the South, in fact. An African proverb says that okra, life is okra. You slip, you fall. You fall, you slip. Right? Says a lot about life. Right? And connecting okra to that is very, very significant. Now, another important crop was sesame. And I put it up there to contrast the pods of sesame seeds to contrast with okra pods. Very similar but very different. And sesame was part of the foodways in South Carolina that the enslaved eat. The enslaved ate the seeds either raw or roasted, boiled them in soups, and pressed them for oil. They ate the leaves as greens or used them to thicken soups or one-pot stews. They also, quote, bake it in their bread, boil it with greens, and enrich their broth with it, reported Thomas Jefferson, who was familiar with sesame in Virginia. He also said that sesame, which was introduced to South Carolina, was brought from Africa many years ago by their Negroes, and by them called Benny. In addition to stating its origin, he uses a form of the name that it is called by in West Africa by the Wolof, the Mandinka, and the Bambara people, Benny. Even today, it's called Benny in South Carolina. You get some Benny wafers. I know you've had some, Bob. Now, another vegetable that made it but did not make it into the American culinary pantheon is the Guinea squash, or jakatu, or kumba, as the Mosai call it in Burkina Faso. But this particular vegetable is one that was used to flavor soups. It was usually put in whole. Even today, it's very valued. It's not something young people tend to like. Older people tend to have a good taste for it. It has a kind of bitterness to it. And whenever I would eat with the family in West Africa, it was me and the dad who were splitting the jakatu. I was old enough to like it, I guess, at the time. But it's also something that by 1700 was being grown here. It is from the eggplant family. It's very different than eggplants, but this was grown. Another crop grown was sorghum. Sorghum, one of the oldest crops that was cultivated in Africa, dates back possibly to the 3rd millennium before the Christian era. It was also referred to as guinea corn, and it was grown in the Low Country at least by 1720. Sources say it was first introduced from Africa by the Negroes, and the enslaved established and used sorghum in the Carolina colony, made bread out of it, boiled it, and used it to feed fowls. Millet was another of those West African old cereal crops that was grown by African people in South Carolina. With a smaller grain, it was often confused with sorghum at first because it was similar and Europeans were not familiar with either of them. It was said that sorghum and millet were rarely seen, but in plantations of Negroes who brought it from Guinea, their native country, and are therefore fond of having it. Now, one of the interesting things about sorghum and millet is that they also replenish soil that's been depleted, right? And one of the things, it came to be a very important crop in the Sugar Islands, in Barbados in particular, because it could grow in the soil that had been depleted by the sugar cane. So it was grown, and this is also another point that I'm not exploring, but often the lands that were utilized for gardens And if we expand that to the Caribbean and look at provision grounds and other things, wasn't the best of land, right? So in order to make it, land that would grow, folks had to know something about how to get nutrients in the soil and so forth. And they couldn't go to, Mahoney's and buy, a bag of fertilizer. It had to come from a body of knowledge that was held not only about the soil, but about which plants and what they took from the soil, what they added to the soil. It also involved knowing how to create terraces or hillocks and other things for this growth. So while we're looking at these particular crops, we're also looking at a whole depth of knowledge that underlies this. Now, I'm going to have two more, just mention two more of the crops that were grown there. And what I have found is at least 20 different vegetables that were grown that had their origin in Africa and were grown in North America. This is just the vegetable plants. I didn't get into medicinal plants or others, vegetable plants. And these next two are things which have shaped America in a way that we can't argue with the fact that it has had an impact on America. Right? One of those is watermelon, which, whether it's realized or not, was first domesticated in West Africa. And it was in African American gardens by the early 18th century. In South Carolina, Guinea melons were being grown at least by 1720. And in Virginia, in 1737, they said it was blacks who grew large amounts of melons. And it was believed they were speaking of watermelons because of the language used. It is not clear when it was first cultivated and consumed in North America, but both black and white Virginians had given food, had grown fond of it by the 1730s. Now, one of the things, it's wonderful when you can recognize the influences that you utilize. And so I want to recognize Bob Hall in the back of the room for a moment. He did an article called Food Crops, Medicinal Plants, and the Atlantic Slave Trade. And in that article, there was this wonderful poem about watermelons that I wanted to kind of share from 1809. And it says, "The watermelon most they love, I never could the fruit approve. It was so very light and sweet, it did not seem as fit to eat. Melting so quickly in the mouth like syllabub and trifle froth, yet during autumn's sultry air, its coolness was delicious fare." Right? And they were so popular, very much part of America culinary choices. And then there's the peanut, right? Or ground nuts as they were often called. First introduced to North America by Africans in their gardens. And this is interesting occurrence since peanuts were first domesticated by Amerindians in Bolivia thousands of years ago. However, in the 16th century, Portuguese ships carried peanuts from Brazil to West Africa, where it was adopted into the agricultural system very rapidly. They were cultivated all over West Africa by 1560. Its quick adoption and spread was probably due to its similarity to the Bambara groundnut, but they were very popular. They were roasted, they were boiled, they were eaten in all kinds of ways in stews. One of the very popular West African dish these days is called mafe, which is a stew with a peanut butter sauce that's really, and a little pepper. Oh, I'm not going to go down that road today, though. One of the other things about peanuts, because they had a shell, they were protected and did not spoil rapidly. And so they became part of the foods that were utilized in the Atlantic crossing to America. By 1700, they were being planted and consumed by the enslaved in South Carolina and Virginia, providing an additional source of protein and nourishment. And right now, the Virginia peanut is the largest peanut, right? And for me, I'm a peanut person. I like peanuts. This is just as an aside. And South Carolina, Virginia, and Senegal all have great peanuts, you know, and I can say they're all different, they're all great. And I always bring them with me when I go to Senegal. The last time, when I opened my suitcase at customs, all you could smell was peanuts. Everybody he said, "Do you have agricultural products?" I said, "Just peanuts." He said, "Get out of here." So anyway, but these are all examples based on when these vegetables were first mentioned in written documents. These are not the only way that African provenance of these vegetables is known. Along with commentaries and observations made about the origin of these early plants, their arrival in North America from Africa is reflected in the names that they are known by. Okra, the name this pod is most known by, comes from Okuru among the Igbo of Nigeria. Gumbo, or Gingombo, or Kigombo, from the Bantu. Sesame, the Beni, as I mentioned. For peanuts, goobers, from the Nguba of the Congo, and pindars from Mpinda. And also, when they did not utilize the African names or did not know the African names, they did give them names that reflected their origin. So sorghum and millet became guinea corn. Watermelon became a guinea melon. And the African eggplant became guinea squash. And Eliza Lucas referred to the Malagueta peppers as Negro peppers. Right? And so that also points to their origin. Where were they from? Never saw that before. That's a Guinea thing. Okay. So that is also another way. Now, one other thing about these gardens that's important is that they also relied on the crops and agricultural knowledge of the indigenous populations. In the 17th centuries, observations in Virginia commented on gardens of the enslaved and what they grew. Most of the foods that they mentioned in some of those early years were those that had been adopted from the indigenous population. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, potato pumpkins, Indian peas, and simnels, a small squash, simling squash actually, or patty pan squash as we call them. During the colonial era, indigenous people still lived in Virginia, and I think the battery just died. You have time to let you find plugs. There were interactions between indigenous people and transplanted Africans in several ways. A good number of Native Americans were enslaved and labored alongside enslaved Africans and African Americans. This is one of the ways. This is particularly the case in South Carolina, but also in Virginia it happened. But in South Carolina, this was very much something that took place because in the early, in the late 17th century, one of the things that South Carolina was deeply engaged in was a trade in enslaved indigenous people. Not only keeping them there, but also transporting them to colonies in other places of the British Empire, like New England, and having come across some references to enslaved people who were referred to as Spanish Indians from Florida or others, I saw that connection. So enslaved people worked together. You also, their settlements were removed from the landscape where they were enslaved. So getting there was a way to find independence and move away from enslavement. And also there were marriages between indigenous people and African people. And through this interaction, there were exchanges of knowledge, exchanges of practices, exchanges of information. Thank you, Bob. Foods is one of the ways that we see those exchanges, right? Africans adopted corn, bean, and squash, the three sisters. And one of the foods that was rapidly adopted was corn, right? But corn had also made its way to Africa in the 16th century and quickly spread, so it wasn't unfamiliar. So corn was readily seen in these gardens. One crop that did not, the other thing was beans, right? I mentioned black-eyed peas. There were also the hyacinth beans that came in. There were the red pigeon peas that are in the Sea Islands still today. And these were there. And they went with the beans that Indians were growing as well. And they were an important source of sustenance and nutrition. Let me see. Another, which I'll mention briefly, was the tomato. Right? The tomato became very much a part of the culinary practice, but the tomato is a very interesting thing, very much like the peanut. The tomato was first domesticated in the area of Mexico and Central America. It was taken by the Spanish in the 16th century through the Caribbean and then to Europe. And by second half of the 16th century, it had made its way to West Africa, where it was utilized in the cuisine there. Now, when we look at North America, the first mention of tomatoes is in South Carolina in 1710, when naturalist William Salmon reported seeing them there. He said they were possibly introduced from the Caribbean, which is quite possible since they had spread in the Caribbean. They had been in Barbados. It was folks from Barbados who left and came to South Carolina and brought with them, I think it was at least 100 enslaved people in that first year. And those enslaved people were responsible for some of those early gardens as well. Now, the interesting thing about this, the British, and many people were skeptical of tomatoes. We know about Jefferson's work with tomatoes and all of that, but they were skeptical, and it wasn't until mid-19th century that it really began to be utilized regularly as food there. I found this interesting because what that says is that West Africans were growing and using tomatoes about a century before they were introduced into North America. And they were introduced into North America by people of African descent in South Carolina. Something we don't connect with tomatoes, right? But with peanuts, tomatoes, and other crops. The peanut and tomato, they had to voyage before they made it to North America. They came the long route, right? Now, one other crop that was not an edible crop, but that was very instrumental, that was grown by both native people and African transplants, were the bottleneck gourd. Bottleneck gourds were grown, they're grown on vines. Indigenous populations had grown them, West Africans had grown them. They use them for a number of things. They are dried, they can be cut, used for spoons or other utensils, they can be used for bowls, they can be used for storing things. And there's a story of some of the botanists from England utilizing bottleneck gourds to store seeds that they were shipping and transporting and sharing with other people. So the bottleneck gourd was another. Now basically, the journey of these African foods from plot to plate to dietary and commercial staples demonstrates the broader relationship of food to culture and culture to identity. The production of food is both resistance to imposed diets and an exercise of choice over foods used for daily subsistence. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that cultural resistance takes many forms. Right? A remembered way of living is a form of cultural resistance. Recreating something that was from another place is a form of resistance. Now, these early foods, both those that were brought from the African continent and those adopted from the Amerindian people, formed the foundation of African American cuisine. Even considering regional variations, the ways Africans and African Americans utilized foods in these early coastal societies continued. The foods that made up much of the enslaved person's diet brought together these foods in ways that were neither exact replicas of African or Native American dishes. They were something that was distinctly African American, a synthesis of African and African American foodstuffs and cooking techniques. As Native peoples were removed from the landscape, and saltwater Africans, or new arrivals, diminished, their skills and knowledge of food production and preparation remained as foundations for a distinctly African American cuisine. But these foods did not only impact African American cuisine. As I mentioned, feeding the colonies, and particularly a concern, was feeding the sugar colonies, which were part of the British Empire, right? And many of those sugar colonies were food deficient because, like in Barbados, which was relatively flat, they realized that they could use the land to grow sugar. So food was jettisoned, basically. It was imported. And finding the foods that were going to fulfill that was an important part. This is what led to an interest in the crops that the enslaved people were growing. They became essential in feeding the colonies, and during these years in South Carolina, for example, the chief domestic crops were corn, beans, and squash, which had come from the indigenous population, rice, okra, and cowpeas from Africa. Right. So very much, as they began producing more food, they began to realize that there were other possibilities that were connected to them. I just want to talk about two. One of the things that happens also, as you've probably read, as the 18th century continues and gardens become, or vegetable gardens become more a part of plantation societies and more a part of the colonial societies, you begin to get more imports of seeds from Europe and other things. And as they are being grown, the enslaved are doing a lot of the planting of them. They are also borrowing and utilizing them. And as they do this, this is where you begin to get some of the marketable aspects in. And you can read about Washington or Jefferson or others purchasing vegetables from the enslaved people who were on their plantations. And what's interesting, and I saw one note about this often, these were purchased in off seasons, like cucumbers in December, things like that. So they had a way of storing, right? And that's a whole nother thing with the root cellars under cabins and so forth. But they had a way of storing them and bringing them out and selling them at the times needed. But one of the products I mentioned was rice, right? Now, by the 1690s, rice was seen as a food that could feed South Carolina and the sugar colonies. Utilizing the knowledge and skills of Africans from the initial planting of seed rice through the care, harvesting, and preparing of the crop, the cultivation of rice was expanded. And by the 1720s, Carolina was exporting 10 million pounds of rice per year. It moved into South Carolina producing rice for the world ultimately. Now, initially this rice was going to, as I mentioned, the Caribbean, along with black-eyed peas, as I mentioned. Beans and rice were very important for the Caribbean. However, it was sent there. The beans, they said, were for the poorest sort of white people and for Negro slaves, which says something about the status that was attached to food, ideas about who food was proper for, because Europeans generally, even when they began to look at these foods, were a bit shy about consuming them. Slave food was not something that was consumed by people who did not see themselves as enslaved. And so one of the things was what other products there were. For sesame and peanuts, oil became the thing that they looked at. And this was very important at this time period because they were looking for, in England, they were looking for ways to break from having to rely on olive oil from the Mediterranean Catholic countries. Right. In 1730, a colonial official sent samples of sesame seed and oil to England and told them about its uses. They saw that it could be a very good salad oil, but did not see it as a cooking oil at that time. Peanuts were also part of it, but Europeans did not eat peanuts. That was slave food, and thus it was not part of their culinary world. It was in 1760s that they began to look at peanuts, and not as food, but for use as an oil. In 1769, a North Carolina plantation owner sent peanuts and peanut oil to to the Royal Society as a way to consider it as a way to break this dependence on olive oil. This is what was said about it. I lay before you some pods of a vegetable and the oil pressed from their contents. They are the product of a plant well known and much cultivated in the southern colonies and in our American sugar islands, where they are called ground nuts or ground peas. They are originally, it is presumed, of the growth of Africa and brought from thence by the Negroes, who use them as food, both raw, roasted, and are very fond of them. They are therefore cultivated by them in the little parcels of land set apart for their use by their masters. By these means, this plant has extended itself. Right? So this tells us a great deal, even with my typo at the end, but it tells us a great deal about the origin of peanuts, about their use. It mentions growing them on land set apart for their use, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives us a great deal of information. But these crops and knowledge about them, which was held by the enslaved Africans, is something that was extremely, extremely important part of the American culinary history and development. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is the experimental archaeology that has been utilized, which is really what the window that brought me into this at all. We know much more about the influence on the cuisine, about foods, but we don't know where those foods came from. So, in cooperation with a few other folks, we started ASHE, the African American Seed Exchange, which is in cooperation with the Middleton Place Foundation and brings together descendants of the enslaved community, scholars, local community members, and agriculturalists on the journey of exploration of one of the earliest African cultural creations in North America, with the goal of learning about these seeds, learning about their propagation, learning about the knowledge systems that underlie them. And another, which is another goal, the agricultural knowledge that is there. And we want to get a sense of the agricultural knowledge of traditional techniques of growing foods that came from Africa, the adoption of the first food production knowledge of indigenous populations whose lands they were settled on, the use of food crops that came from Europeans who claimed their labor, and the knowledge of the local pharmacopoeia and how to use it for medicinal and health purposes. Now, I tried to focus on plants, vegetable plants. I didn't get into medicinal plants. I didn't get into the animals, right? I didn't get into the transportation of those, because one of the things that was very common along with gardens, was to have a chicken run or a place for chickens. And often those were the guinea hens that came from West Africa. So one of the things, there's a lot more when we get into that, when we get into other foodstuffs and connect the whole thing. I was focusing, because of our project, on seeds and the foods that were grown from them. What I would say is that African agricultural knowledge was an essential part of colonial America. The foods became an essential part of the American diet, and it is something that I hope we will spend more time thinking about and examining. And thank you.